We're rolling. Okay, everybody. We are here to talk about what we're doing in Mod 3. Now, this is going to be kind of an interesting chat because, if I'm being honest, I don't know. More specifically, I know the specific things that I want you to come out of this mod able to do, but like we had clear themes in the mods before. This doesn't really have a clear theme. So the staff, we've kind of largely been calling this Mod 2 Part 2. And I just talked with someone at HQ, and he agreed that like that's probably the best way to describe what this is. All the same stuff we did before. We're making front ends in JavaScript. We're making back ends in Rails. But we're trying to do this at a deeper level. Is I don't know if you realize this, there was more to JavaScript and Rails than what we did last time. So you've already seen some of this. So we're, I think, largely feeling pretty good with events right now, hopefully. Probably ditto for fetch at this point. Maybe a little bit of iffiness on that. And so let's talk about some of these other ones. I had you guys on Monday reviewing Es2015 Techniques. Actually, before we talk about those, you probably also saw this called ES6. I really hate that term. Let's first just kind of talk as a group about the ES part of it, and then we'll compare these two numbers. So, what is ES? ECMAScript. Wait a minute, I thought we were doing JavaScript. What's ECMAScript?
Standards for JavaScript?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. What else can you guys tell me about ECMAScript? Let's roll back a little bit. What's JavaScript? Give me some history. What do you know?
It's like made or something.
It was, in fact, made this in a week. That's a good bit of trivia to know. Do you know who made it?
Or anything else, I guess. So no.
He's still a fairly relevant character. So ECMAScript is JS standards. JS was made in a week. It was made by a guy named Brendan Eich. And anytime I talk about Brendan Eich, I kind of feel obligated to show this off. This is like one of my brags that I get to do. Brendan Eich, Twitter. And if I time travel back a ways, I get this. We were talking about ska music. So, all right. So it was made in a week, made by Brendan Eich. Anybody know where Brendan Eich happened to be working at the time? Who he made it for? Oh, I heard it. Netscape. So he made it for Netscape. Is anybody old enough or well-read enough to know the relevance of Netscape to what we do right now? Or what the browser wars were? Oh, wow. Fetuses.
I feel like I kind of remember, but I'm not sure.
Cool. Oh, like bits and pieces. What do you got?
I don't know. That's why I didn't want to say anything, but I feel like I know something.
Doesn't Netscape own Mozilla right now? Like Firefox?
Other way around. When Mozilla cratered, Brendan Eich started Mozilla. And is like largely the spiritual successor of that mission. So, once upon a time, there was a big browser Made by Microsoft. Microsoft owned the home computing world. And if you can fucking believe it, they were once successfully sued for a monopoly by having the audacity to bundle a browser with their operating system. Who can compete with that? If the operating system includes a browser, that's the only way you're going to get on the internet. Who's going to look for other browsers? And so the upstart competitor to IE, and like, I think I'm not entirely sure about this. I'm fairly positive you had to go to a store and buy it. But there was a product called Netscape Navigator that was a competing browser to Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer at the time, though, had something like 95% user share. And Navigator had like the other 5. So they start competing with each other on features. All right, who can make the killer feature that's really going to win the browser wars? And among them, we got CSS out of it. Browsers didn't like always have CSS as part of it. You just kind of got the browser styles. So, all right, well, we get CSS, which is really part of HTML. Those are not, so like those have the same standards body. They're two sides of the same coin. And then Navigator comes out, or Netscape comes out with this thing that it was originally called LiveScript. And it was a way to do light software programming kinds of things in the browser. At the time, this was limited to shit like cursor effects and like scroll tricks. Like it was kind of a toy for like special effects and stuff. It was originally called LiveScript. Java was immensely popular at the time. It had come out pretty recently, and it was getting a lot of attention. And they're like, we'll capitalize on the success of that by renaming this JavaScript. By the way, that is 100% of the relationship between Java and JavaScript, is this was believed to be good marketing.
Didn't you say there's something called CoffeeScript too?
Yes, CoffeeScript's super recent.
Okay. Is that related to the fact that it's Java?
Nope.
Okay.
Oh, like other than like they're both coffee references.
Right.
Yeah. Internet Explorer also had their own like kind of scripting language, and I can't for the life of me remember what it was called. IE original scripting language. Yeah, I think it was called ActiveScript, which doesn't have anything to do with the Adobe thing of the same name. VB script. No, it wasn't that. Like I said, I'm fairly certain it was called ActionScript. Don't quote me on that, though. But through a very strange series of events, like this ended up all of this really ended up losing out to Flash. You want to do something cool on the web, you pretty much had to do it in Flash. Then Steve Jobs declares Flash dead because he didn't want to support it on the iPhone, and like it effectively killed off Flash. Now, what had happened in the meantime is pretty curious. JavaScript keeps growing. They keep adding features to it. And as Netscape kind of buckles a little bit, they decide to take what was JavaScript, which is a like proprietary trademark owned by Netscape, and they put a standards body in charge of it that's part of ECMA. ECMA is just a general standards body. I think they also do standards for like car seat belts and all sorts of other shit. And so the reference spec for like what qualifies as JavaScript is now called ECMAScript. And it's governed by a body, anybody know? Called, it's kind of a cryptic name. The ECMAScript spec is managed by TC39. TC stands for Technical Committee. And it's a group of highly influential internet people and big companies, and all of them talk about what is and isn't JavaScript. So if you want to see an interesting example of that, if we go over to help.js, here we go. From today, this is Danny. Did he talk to you guys? Were you students when he came in and talked? Can't remember. All right. He watches the TC39 stuff really closely. But infix bang has been removed as a proposed feature, which was going to be a new syntax thing, which is tilde and then dot. And then we spend the rest of the day trying to figure out what the fuck it even was in the first place. But it was something to do with chaining promises without using .then. But it's still active work that's being done. So TC39 comes out with ES1, the original spec, and then they're batching these big changes together. So there's one a couple years later called ES2, and there's one called ES3. ES4 was a complete shit show, so it was abandoned. And most of if you look at old Learn JavaScript references, a lot of what you see is ES5. People will call this old school JavaScript code. Things like map filter reduce, those got added in ES5. But they were new features that were added to the language. And then an interesting thing happened. So we do a hard break, and TC39 announces that they're going to do a completely different model of releasing features. What they're going to do is they're just going to release stuff one feature at a time. And there's this new proposal system that they're going to use. You start with what's called a straw man. Straw man is just a wild ass idea about something that could possibly be in the language, and anybody can submit one. If the straw man gets some steam behind it, it's called a stage 0 proposal. And then you have to start writing out how it could theoretically be implemented. Then it moves to a stage 1 proposal. And for it to move through the various stages, it needs to start getting used out in the wild, which also means it needs to start getting implemented by browsers. Because while TC39 can say this is what JavaScript is, there's still people at Microsoft and Mozilla and Google who have to actually write these things for their browsers. And all of them have slightly different implementations. So there's always some big gap in there. And it's happened in the past that the ECMA, the TC39 group, has said, this is going to be part of JavaScript. And a browser vendor has gone, nope. And if that browser vendor happens to be Chrome, which currently has 80% market share, then it just doesn't fucking happen. So it's a very interesting dynamic that they have. But Google has representatives on TC39 also. So the first thing that happens after this ES5 release is we get a fuck ton of features all at once. So this is promises. This is, I'm spacing on it now. The rest and spread operator. This is destructuring. All of those kinds of things came all at once in a release that is erroneously called ES6, but is more accurately called Es2015. So this, what the TC39 said that they wanted to do was referring to features that came out in a particular year by the name of that year, rather than doing this ES6, ES7, ES8. And you'll hear people say ES7 sometimes, but like even by then, like people were starting to realize how ridiculous this is starting to sound. So like ES2016, we got a couple cool features in there. ES2017, we got async await out of that, but like almost nothing else. And anyway, that's how it works from now on. Coincidentally, CSS works the same way. After CSS3, the group that does CSS, which is a partner organization at TC39 called the WG, which does HTML and CSS, also agreed that they were going to stop doing big bang releases of CSS. And instead, they have like a separate spec for colors and a separate spec for sizes. And they just update any of those as like new innovations happen. So that is a long-winded and very didactic explanation of what I mean by refactoring with ES2015 plus features. So you guys did some reading on those yesterday. What did you find? What are some cool features? I already said some of them. Spread. What else? Destructuring. Uses the same operator. What else? Oh, sorry, no, it doesn't. Destructuring, which you can do with objects and arrays. What else? Yeah.
Fat arrow.
Fat arrow. What else? Yep. Template literals. What else? Async await. We don't use async await as an alternative syntax to like promise chains with like .then and stuff. Any other ones jump out? Classes. What else? Modules. Thank you. Import, export. Anything else? Generators. I don't care if you come out of this program knowing how to use generators. They're a little more advanced than the kinds of things that we do, but it's worth knowing that word at least. And a generator is a function that you can enter and exit and then re-enter. Any other ES2015 things? Same operator as spread.
Default parameters.
Yeah. Any other ones you know? Do I have that one up here? Nope, I don't. Promises. How about, actually, I was going to say fetch, but little known piece of trivia. Fetch is not part of JavaScript. That's why it doesn't exist in Node by default. It's part of HTML. This is a pretty good list. So to give you an idea of what I mean by refactor application, geez, guys remember this?
Oh my god.
Yeah. Wow. It looks so complicated.
I know, like you guys, I believe I remember your cohort. You're like, I can't figure it out. How? I mean, you guys shat yourself over this. Think about how far you've come. You really have. Cool. So if I go in here and I do something like some object and I give it a key and a key and a key, Anybody know what it means to destructure that object? Or how I would do it? Katie?
Does it mean that you take the elements out of the object?
That's exactly it. So it looks the same as object syntax. We just do it backwards. So you do const A and B equals some object. What do you think that does? Any guesses?
The A and B value?
Yeah? This makes new variables named A and B that are equal to those values. So if I do that, and I do A, 1, B, 2. It's pretty cool, huh? Yeah. So this is really useful if you're passing something into an object or into a function, and then you want to make all of those individual variables. You don't have to do some object dot, some object dot, some object dot over and over and over again. You can destructure all that stuff out. Pretty cool. What about spread? What's spread do?
Isn't that like multiple uses, or is it mainly just?
Oh yeah, it has tons of uses. Yeah,
Basically just takes the brackets off of an array.
that's it. It's a great way to put it. So if I have some array, 1, 2, 3, I want to use all of these without the brackets, which there's a surprising number of use cases for that. Like let's say if I made a function called sum that took in number 1, number 2, and number 3. And returns number 1, number 1 plus number 2 plus number 3. I could do something like sum. Crap. Sum array and spread all of the pieces of that, and it's like I entered each of those in as arguments. Pretty dope. Or I could make const some copy of an array by spreading some array inside of square brackets. Just makes a copy of it. Dope! Because like if I take some array and start popping, like that takes things out of the array. It actually changes the array, right? Not some copy of an array. Really cheap way to make a copy of something. Cool. Now let's say I wanted to do a different version of that sum. That like, okay, well what if I wanted to take an arbitrary amount of numbers? I could call this better sum and do dot 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 numbers. That's the rest operator. That's saying combine all of the things that get passed into this into an array. And so maybe I do something like numbers dot reduce some number and then return sum plus number. Cool. So now I can do better sum and give it just an arbitrary number of arguments. And oops, shit. I knew it. I need to return that reduce.
You need a initial value.
You don't actually, but
Oh, you don't?
no. It's better practice too, though. numbers.reduce. Crap. Oh, God, this is going to take forever. Killing me. Some number. And good. There we go. Now if I do better sum like that, now I can work with the variable number of arguments. Sick. We've worked with promises a bit, with also true. And so we just talked about rest and spread. We talked about destructuring. We've done fat arrows a bit. We've done template strings a bit. Async await's kind of an interesting one. So instead of, say, if I touch app.js, you've seen the syntax where we do something like fetch some URL dot then response.json, and then we take the response and we do something with response. We've seen that pattern over and over again, right? What if I told you that another way that we could do that, actually, to make this more clear, I'm going to write this in a function. Function get Pokemon. Cool. We've done that before. We could also write that now as what we call an async function. You just put the async keyword in front of the function. And now, instead of all those horrible, confusing .thens, we can do stuff like const response equals await fetch URL, and then say const parsed response equals await response.json, and then do something with parsed response. Or we could make that a let and overwrite it. And that ends up being the exact same thing. The problem, the reason I don't like them, is I have this really cool catch pattern here. And that's really slick. I can also put them anywhere in this chain and do different things in response. Or I can put this one at the end and just kind of have as a catch-all. What I have to do here is put it in old-timey try-catch blocks. Doesn't look quite as elegant now. And also, here I could replace each of these with named functions. Not anymore. This OOP people lost their shit when this came out. Finally! Functional people lost their shit when this came out. The ECMA or TC39 has been playing both sides of that fence for aggressively for 5 years. That's why we got things like the spread operator and the class keyword. Makes everybody happy, pisses everybody off. Classes, they work deceptively like and not like they do in Ruby. Mainly that self keyword, as confusing as that may have seemed in Ruby, it actually means something pretty consistent. It's either referring to the object or the class, and it's very clear when it's doing one or the other. The this keyword in JavaScript, not so forgiving. That actually, it has 8 different possible meanings. I'm not exaggerating that. And that can change pretty rapidly when you're using the class syntax in old JS. So I don't like it that much, but you do have a standard for playing with that, as you should be familiar with it. Modules, you guys have figured out by now that if you want to have your JavaScript in more than one file, it's actually kind of hard. You put those in like different script tags in the HTML. What if I told you? We could do things like I have file1 and file2 JS, and I could do something like make a function in one of them and then export it. Sorry, it's the node syntax. Export default and like that. And then over in file 2, I can import sum from file 1 and then call sum in there. That's modules. So now we can use more than one file, but the HTML file only imports one thing. We'll end up probably not doing a ton of that in this mod, but like this is your bread and butter in React. You do that all day long. Yeah?
If you have file 1 in your HTML, could you only export from that one?
This is where this gets tricky. You tend to not do that with the kinds of JS apps that you guys have been doing. That's why I say we probably won't actually get a lot of action out of this in this mod. Where you use this more is with things like React or Vue or Ember or Angular, where we're writing all these apps and then compiling them into one JavaScript file. That's where this sees more action. But it's kind of exciting because as of like a couple months ago, it used to be that import and export didn't even exist in the browser. They were just part of the ECMAScript spec, but hadn't actually been implemented by any browser vendors yet, and now they're pretty widely supported. So that may change in the future, but not today. Good question. Cool. Default params, they work the exact same way they did in Ruby. Promises, we might go a little bit deeper on, and generators, don't worry about it. Cool. So if you can do those things, like you are as cutting edge a JavaScript developer as anybody is right now. This discuss common topics relating to the web and the internet. This one's a little bit of a catch-all. So I wanted this to be, we haven't done a whole lot of programmer theory kinds of stuff. And so I'm still not exactly sure how I want to assess this, but the idea is that I need you to be able to speak fluently about how HTTP requests work, what the relationship between JavaScript and the DOM is, how HTML, CSS, and JavaScript fit together, how JavaScript scope works. And like, I think that you guys intuitively understand a lot of these things now, but somebody in an interview someday is gonna ask you to explain it in words. And you're gonna be like, well, it's sort of like, hang on, if I could just draw it out, it's sort of like, and I wanna give you some practice, like trying to put words to each of these things. Same thing with asynchrony. I think a lot of you were really starting to crack the code on that in the last mod, but being able to like put words to this without tripping over yourself takes practice. And probably a deeper level of understanding than we currently have. So that was the impetus behind those things. And also making sure that you could do map, find, filter, and reduce, and gerbil script. Cool. Yeah.
Can you explain the application of hoisting?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So hoisting, what is hoisting? Who can tell me?
That you can declare and use the assignable to a
Indeed. I can do stuff like this. Even though I haven't declared that function yet, the definition of this function gets hoisted to the very top of the scope. So before anything gets executed, that's available. There are people who don't like that. Why would somebody not like that? Like, what impact does that have on readability?
I just figured maybe you put all your functions.
You're not wrong, but
variables together.
sure. There's a school of thought that says, all right, we keep all of our variable definitions at the top of the scope, and then we use them. If you're from Coberly country, you love hoisting, because I want the top of the scope to say what this is doing. And if I want to know how it's doing it, I'll look down at the definitions. But I don't want to have to get through all the definitions first before I get to what's happening. There are plenty of developers who disagree with me, though. And so another syntax that you'll get used to in this mod, and especially in the next mod, is writing that as const sum equals, and you could either do function, like that, or, because that doesn't hoist. If I do this, that's going to throw an error. And the most common way you'll see this written is as an arrow function, which people have lost their shit over because, like, can you see how much harder that is to read? Like, it's just symbols. Especially if we start combining all that stuff. It's like numbers, and then we do some number. I mean, that barely looks like the same language that we've been writing the last 3 weeks, right? But you'll see stuff like that out in the wild. And so anytime you do, just break it back down into, like, what is happening here. The fat arrow, we know this. This is just another way to write a function. You could swap this out for the function keyword just as easily. And so as you're learning how to read gobbledygook like this, like, take it real slow. You know all of these things already. It's just a very, very condensed way to write it.
What's the reasoning that you can't hoist when you write it like that?
Oh, that's a super good question.
Just because I did this go flag, so I know it reads it twice.
Very nice. So, any guesses why this won't work? The sum won't work, but that will. Hoisted sum is going to work just fine, and it's going to error out on sum. Why is that?
Because with the const you're initializing a variable,
Yep.
and to use it, you can't put the sum before you initialize the variable.
Mhm.
You can before the function.
So a kind of curious thing happens in JavaScript, and this is academic and probably not what we should be doing at 442. But I'll tell you that to hoisting thing in JavaScript, every function or every variable declaration gets hoisted. So if I console log whatever the fuck here, what am I going to get? Nope, undefined. You haven't defined any variable named whatever the fuck. If I do, crap. If I do that, anybody know what I get? Not the same. Not the reduce function. What was that, Ben?
The body, the sum,
Super good guess. Let's see.
Is it null?
So if I do console.log whatever the fuck is not, it throws an error. But if I, let's see, I'm trying to think of how to write this in the console. If I do that, and I declare the function, and I can even put something in here, return 1 + 1. Cool. See how it logged the entire function up there? And everything I need to know about that function. If I do that same thing and do it the other way, oops, other sum, still throws an error. Shoot, that's a Chrome thing. What I'm getting at is, yeah, it's null. It knows the variable was declared. It doesn't know what's in it. So the difference is that with these kinds of assignment operations, I know that a variable was assigned something, but I don't know what it was. With function definitions exclusively, I know that the function was defined and I know what it is. Both of those get hoisted. Like I said, very academic distinction for 445, but that's what it is. And I'm hoping that in the next 3 weeks, we can just get better about talking about these things. Because knowing like weird shit like that will get you a job someday. Maybe not this next one, but having a casual conversation about whether or not to use hoisting and like what the pros and cons are. So we're like, wow, I've never met someone who went to a boot camp who understands this stuff as well as you do.
So if you're going to hoist, is it best practice to just write out function instead of using?
You have to.
Right. Okay. So I guess
Should we
in
ever
what
use
context would you not use function? Is that a good result?
These do the same thing.
Yeah.
This is called a function declaration. This is called a function expression. But I can do sum or hoisted sum. They're not different, other than this one hoists and this one doesn't.
I guess my question is, why wouldn't you sort of default to having the hoisting capability?
Sure, I agree. But think of, especially old school programmers are like, hoisting is so confusing because you can use something before you even know that you have it. And so there's a type of programmer that even before we could do function expressions would still put all of their function definitions at the top because hoisting is too confusing because most languages don't have it. Yeah.
So if you were writing your own like personal project,
Mm-hmm.
do you keep all your functions at the bottom of your file?
Yeah, usually. Because yeah, I'm with Katie. Take advantage of it. I think it's a feature, not a bug.
Does Ruby have hoisting?
No. Now, like Ruby works on a completely different paradigm because everything in Ruby is based on classes and objects. And so a method inside of an object can see all the other methods. So in that sense, you kind of have hoisting, and there's nothing that isn't in a class. But you also can't just declare functions willy-nilly out of nowhere that aren't methods. So there wouldn't be an equivalent kind of idea. Great question. All right, a couple other things I want to hit before we finish the day. So we have a couple other Rails topics that I want to get back to. So these validating data using strong params and model validations, and oh, I saw form validations in here. No, I wanted this to be model validations. I wrote it wrong. these are easy. I mean, you could do both of these in half a day. But before, what I had you doing is just reading whatever parameters you're given and like inserting those into the database. That's actually not that good an idea because people can do kind of malicious shit that way. So what we do instead is we whitelist parameters. We say, all right, you're trying to create a new robot. These are the things that you are allowed to send me. And if you send me other stuff, I just ignore them. That's strong params. Model validations is like, all right, I've added Wonder Woman to the database. If you try to add Wonder Woman again, I'm going to throw an error. Or I'm going to silently tell you that it worked, but not actually try to add Wonder Woman twice. Those kind, or like, I'm not going to allow you to add a superhero with a name longer than 250 characters. These kinds of things are model validations, and they like protect the integrity of your backend. API responses with serializers. You can store data and then send it back down to the client in two different formats. Your client and your backend don't have to both use underscores, for example. You could use underscores in Rails and then use camel casing when you send the API response back. And like the translation between those two things is called serialization. And there's a built-in way in Rails to do that so that you declare a serializer and anytime you give a response, it's formatted consistently. Or for example, I really like the convention where if I'm sending back a robot, I have a top-level key named robot that has the robot that I have, rather than just the root level having their name and age and what make and whatever else. You can enforce that kind of stuff with serializers. This was all of old mod 2, and I'm even considering dropping this, but it's probably worth knowing what rendering a template from a server looks and feels like, because it's still how WordPress works, it's still how Drupal works, it's still how Laravel works in PHP. I mean, right there, I just described something like 50% of tech jobs. They're not great jobs, but I would be doing you a disservice if you had no idea that that was even possible. So we're going to spend as little time as we can get away with exploring that idea. And then what I'm guessing will probably be the trickiest thing we do in this mod, I do want you to be pretty comfortable with authorization, or authentication at least. So hashing, encryption, like just some big picture ideas on this. I don't think any of you should be in charge of the authentication for any kind of app that involves sensitive data or financial transactions for a little bit. But this is one of these things that's probably better to learn in school, honestly. Because it's very heady, it's very complicated, and there aren't, honestly, a lot of great self-learning materials for this. So if we can get some of this in while you're in school, it will probably serve you well in the years to come. And then last thing I want to talk about in this mod is OOP in JavaScript and functional programming in JavaScript. I'm of the belief that starting your programming learning journey with these two paradigms like does more harm than good, because you guys haven't been writing in any paradigm. You've just been writing some code. But there are some thoughts and conventions around how this stuff should be structured. For example, in functional programming, we don't like explicit loops, we don't like conditionals, we don't like variables, which is like a mind-fucky like way to think about your code. But all collectively, what they do is they take the concept of time completely out of your app. There's no this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. It kind of all happens at once. And it's very confusing to read, but it takes 90% of the possible things that can go wrong with your app off the table. So they end up being a lot more predictable and a lot less prone to error. On the complete opposite side of that spectrum, encapsulating state and behavior, object-oriented programming, is incredibly literate. It's very easy to read, but there are just a million and one places that errors can hide. And so, like, when we talk about classes, we also tend to talk about testing in a particular way a lot more to catch those kinds of things. Because now we we can have a lot of errors, so we need to account for them. And one of my favorite things about JavaScript is you can effortlessly jump back and forth between those two paradigms. But it's useful to know that you're working one paradigm or the other, because sometimes crossing the streams just makes your code confusing. So all in all, this ends up being a pretty conceptual, abstract kind of mod. But I think that you're ready for it. I think you've had enough concrete experiences that I'm hoping that this really like juices the last 6 weeks of the program for you and sets you up in the best position possible for your job search. What questions do you have? Yeah.
Are we ever going to go over like writing tests at all?
Yes. The reason it's not on this list is we're not that strict about it, but ideally these are the things that like, if you can't do this coming out of the program, like we did you a disservice. We're not all the way there yet on this, and testing is probably not going to be one of those things. That said, if you go down to the extra resources, I've got testing with RSpec, I've got Cypress testing. I'm not shy about talking about testing topics, but the problem with testing is that to write good tests, you need good code. You can't test bad code. That's almost exclusively what makes it bad code, is that it's untestable. And the way that you write good code is by writing a lot of bad code. And I don't think any of you have written enough bad code yet to be able to write good code for good tests. Consistently, at least. So like learning the syntax for test is fucking easy. We can do that in a couple hours. But learning like what needs to be tested and how you write code in such a way that can be tested, that's a deep topic. And if we have 15 weeks to learn programming, like I have a hard time thinking of a useful, isolated chunk of testing that I could like insist that all of you walk away with. But I would like to give you some exposure to it, but I can't assess exposure. So that's why it's sort of downplayed in the standards. But yeah, I love talking about it. What else? What else do you want to know? Yeah.
A lot of the links to learn lessons and labs we don't have access to.
What? I should have fixed all that this weekend. Can you give me an example?
Down in the encapsulate state and behavior.
Okay.
Basically any of this.
Okay. Oh yeah, those got updated. Good call. I'll take a look through these and try to catch those. So what they did is they have versions of each mod. You guys are on version 3.1 of mod 3. These are links to version 2 of mod 3. And it's a pain in the ass to update these. We have to do it in like several places. So I thought I caught them all this weekend. Good catch. Awesome. What else? Yeah.
Do we still have access to this page after refreshing?
I have no intentions of taking it down. And in fact, there's a newer version.
Like what's it after?
This is the one that I was building last weekend. That, I broke the data for it over the weekend. Nope. There we go. That is the same kinds of things. And then we can add some cool lab. And it's all google.com. And then that shows up there. So this, like, I was hoping to have this ready by Monday, and then I just fucking didn't. But I just added authentication to this over the weekend. It is not my intention to shut anybody out at any point during or after the program. So if that ends up happening, bark at me. But that was an issue I ran into with a similar thing I did at Galvanize, where it was tied to your student Slack account. And then they made the student Slack account a paid student Slack account and kicked people out after they graduated. Same way Flatiron does now. But that wasn't the case when I started it. And so people lost access to it. So smart guy over here is trying to do a better job of that this time. It will probably be linked to your GitHub account. Cool. What else? Also, if you want to see how I built this, I have 7 videos of it doing it live.
Where can we find them?
They are, I think I put them under mod 4 maybe. Yeah, there you go.
Are you writing with React then?
I wrote it with
So
Vue,
we left
actually.
off.
But you can see the kinds of project management-y kinds
So
of
we
things
left
that I did.
off. We had just
Those are all the
finished,
features.
listing resources for standards.
You can
So
see those thin vertical
those are-
slices. You can see me doing the design of the features. You can see my tests.
Sales source count +1.
Those are the tests. So if you want to see what this looks like end to end with like every single part of making software, like I said, 7 videos, super long. What else?
Just one more.
Hmm?
Just like there's so much for each map for each model. So do you have any reference that which one should be learned first and then?
I would do them in order,
or do
just
it?
top to bottom.
Yeah, because there's so many that can be seen.
Like another thing worth mentioning on this, I'm fairly certain that every single one of you could pass the Mod 3 assessment with Code Challenge right now. It's not hard. And so for the next 3 weeks, we get to do a lot of enrichment. And so if it ends up being overwhelming, we can, like I'm not worried about this. This is really like just a matter of like, how much more prepared for professional development life can I make you? But as far as like flat iron kind of stuff goes, I think we're in like above and beyond good shape. What else? Yeah.
So talking about like being able to explain stuff in interviews,
Mm-hmm.
could you explain like async in English?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a very good question. So asynchronous programming refers to not being able to control the order that things occur in and accounting for that. So with asynchronous programming techniques, such as promises and async await, we can say this piece of code should not execute until this piece of code has finished, even if I don't know when that piece of code will wrap up. So you're just explicitly declaring what orders things should happen in, even if you can't control them. And what that has the overall effect of doing is not blocking threads. And this is like a key performance idea. Because we could very easily do this by saying like, okay, I want to fetch out to this resource, and then I want to just pause the program until it comes back. But pause the program in like regular English words, that translates to like check every single tick of the processor until something is done in a program. And so you're like maximizing your processor usage just waiting for something to wrap up, because otherwise how would it know? And so by having these like explicit say, okay, whenever this wraps up, it's going to send a signal, and when you get that signal, do this. We're able to do all kinds of different things that have those dependencies at the same time while not waiting on anything. That's called blocking. If somebody said that to me, I'd go, okay, cool, you understand how async works. What else? Yeah.
When you're executing a promise and that promise is executing, and then the rest of your code is executing
Mhm.
waits,
Yes.
is
So,
that happening in a separate execution context, or like
not really.
what's happening?
Good question. So I fetch something, and then I do something, and then I do something, and then I do something. And then after that, I do a bunch of other crap. So what happens is this fetch, which is asynchronous, fires off. And before any of these things happen, it just starts running the rest of the program. And it actually goes through everything synchronous that it can until it hits the next asynchronous thing. So we fetch, we do this assignment, we do this map, we fetch, but before this executes, we check to see if any of these are done. And if this one is done, cool. Then what about, was the thing in here asynchronous or synchronous? If it was synchronous, we probably move on to the next one. If it's asynchronous, we check to see if this one is ready. That's how it works. But it's all one execution context. It's technically one thread, which is a processor core. But it's how we're able to do all of these things seemingly simultaneously, even though they take variable amounts of time to happen. What else?
What's an example of something that would be synchronous versus asynchronous?
Sure. These two things are synchronous. Like, there's no waiting. The processor just does them as quickly as it can. If I make a network request, I have no control over how long that takes. I might have to go to space and back. I might send it to a server that needs to do 4 hours of processing on it, and then it comes back. I can make the program try to guess and wait. Don't do that. Instead, just say, hey, whenever you're done with this, let me know, and then do this. And whenever the thing that returns out of that is done, which can also be asynchronous, whenever that's done, and then do this, and then do this. But if we don't control some part of it, which also includes things like reading files off the computer, that can take an arbitrary amount of time to do. And so you want to handle all of those things asynchronously, so that other things in your program that are either synchronous or also asynchronous and might happen faster get a chance to go, so that the processor isn't spending any time not working.
What if your math function, for example, requires data to bring exception?
Sure.
Does it stop there or does it skip?
No. So this can't access anything inside of these.
Right.
They're different function scopes, right? So if I did need to get some data out of this and map over it, then that synchronous map needs to happen inside of that. Great question. What else? Shit, maybe we just do this for 3 weeks. Cool. So, like I said, we're going to kind of figure this out a little bit, but as far as like flat iron program outcomes go, like you're kind of all winning already. So I just want to make this as, take advantage of like this gift that we have and do something good with it. Cool. Let's wrap. I'm going to send out the survey, fill it out, and then let's stand down. Any song requests? Song requests? Anyone? What? Feel Good Ink? Huh? Huh? Shaka shaka. Yes, please.
Okay, so what fetch is doing is going somewhere, and
Yep.
we have a dot then, and it's saying once you've gone here, then do this, and then if this is complete.
Pause.
Okay.
Once that has finished, do this.
Ah, yes. So once that fetch is finished, then do this. Once that has finished.
Pause. Do this with the result of that. Because like we get the response back,
Yeah.
whatever you return from one of those thens, or any asynchronous operation becomes available to whatever the next block is.
Okay, so
Keep going.
once the fetch has finished, with that response, do this.
Mhm.
Once that has finished, then with that response, do this. And then what it's saying is, it's like, this is all happening over here, and it's allowing all our other code, because if we didn't have the fetch, our code would stop running.
Yes.
Because it would
Yes.
be waiting for it to finish until it continues to run.
Correct.
Thank you.
Hell yeah, man. We got it. Cool. Awesome.
Beautiful.
And for the functions, the reason you can hoist functions is that because JavaScript on that first read through saves a function and it all allocates that memory and what a function, like, gives it the availability.
It does that with
scope.
every single variable definition, including functions. The thing that's different with hoisting a function is it also hoists the
Oh, I don't know what you're asking.
definition.
Okay.
So hoisting the name of the variable, that
Yeah.
happens with every single variable, including functions on that first read through.
Okay.
The thing that's different with the functions is the definition of the function
Yes.
also hoists.
Yes, because the second read through is when it gets the information of what a variable is being set to.
Exactly.
But the first read through, it's undefined.
Correct.
But the function isn't undefined.
Yes.
It holds that definition.
Yes. You got it.
Let's go apply for jobs.
Love it.
Cool. That lab actually helped a lot with understanding the JavaScript read through.
Good.
This is what happens. I get fired up. I'm like, what's on?
Good.
Yeah, I would go.
So it's just simple, like writing simple functions.